Analysis machine, are you there?
At your service.
Enter the dual terminal.
Stand by for hyperdrive.
Going fast makes me feel alive. My heart beats in hyperdrive. Do you think you can win? Only if I lose. Just let destiny choose.
Hey guys, this is D Reaper, and today we're gonna have another conversation about Yu-Gi-Oh! Yu-Gi-Oh! As a game is cracked. Now, I enjoy Yu-Gi-Oh! As much as the next guy, probably a bit more, and I've been thinking to myself, what would it take to actually fix Yu-Gi-Oh? But Reaper, just because you suck at the game doesn't mean it's broken. Yeah, cool story. Now, I'm gonna need everyone who hasn't been dueling for more than a decade to kindly have a seat on that bench over there. Yep, that one. Way over there. Just have a seat right there. Alright, so we should just have the old dogs here. And probably everyone else. I'd be surprised if the young bloods today showed such blind respect for their seniors. But before I get accused of gatekeeping, relax. There is a madness to my method. The reason I specified 10 years of dueling experience is because you'd likely need to be dueling for at least that long to recall some of the fundamental changes to our game. Some more recent duelists are probably not aware that we used to have only one type of monster in the extra deck, or that there was an era where there could only be one face-up field spell at a time, or even that pendulum zones and extra deck monster zones didn't used to exist. These are examples of changes to the fundamental rules of Yu-Gi-Oh! So what's Reaper's point? With all the new cards we get in Yu-Gi-Oh! And the ever-present power creep, I fear the structure of the game struggles to keep up. One reason we've had so many emergency ban lists in recent years. Heck, it's the reason we have ban lists, period. But let's face it, Konami, Ko-Money.
You did the joke backwards.
Did I though? The point is the people in charge don't seem quite as concerned with balancing their game as the average Yu-Gi-Oh! Player. Which is why most of us have to suffer through months of still unbalanced gameplay while waiting for something to change. Then after one or two ban lists that don't address the glaring issues, we get about a month of relative peace, rinse, and then repeat. With the constant evolution of new cards, it's going to take more than a biased ban list to restore balance, and I think we're well overdue for a rule change to help keep up with the more modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Era. So, here are 10 suggested rule changes to address some of the current problems in the game. Okay, so let's put first things first by talking about, well, who's going first. The player who moves first in Yu-Gi-Oh! Has always had something of an advantage, and it's an advantage gap that has continued to widen over time. But before you say, but Reaper, my deck is better going second. That's great. I typically opt to go second as well, but the reality of the player going first having a major advantage is not up for debate. Konami already tried reducing the advantage via a rule change, skipping the first draw phase of the player who goes first, effectively having them start with 5 cards instead of 6. And even the loss of a card was not enough to bridge the gap. Today most duelists would still prefer to go first, because it still gives them a sizable advantage. But if you need even more proof, I have a personal account to share. I'm sure none of you have ever experienced anything like this, but during last year's Master Duel Cup, I had a lot of disconnection issues when trying to start a match. It's certainly more than I was used to. It was a real shame too, because it looked like Lady Luck was on my side. I'd won 5 coin tosses in a row, and never got to play any of those matches. I even tried restarting my Switch and checking my wireless connection to see if I could find the issue, but everything seemed to be working in good order. But when I tried to start up another match, when I once again won the coin toss, I got another disconnect. At this point I was really frustrated, thinking it might be a server issue or too much online traffic, something like that. But just for good measure, I tried one more time. I lost the coin toss and suddenly the match started up normally. Curse my rotten luck, I thought. It just so happened that the one time I lost the coin toss is when the match connects. Hey, wait a minute. And I made the connection. I had the analysis machine run the numbers over the next 24 hours, and I kid you not, 9 out of 10 coin toss wins resulted in immediate disconnect. It was so unbelievable I went online to see if this was a trend, and sure enough, we got a hit. Now whether or not you want to debate the moral integrity of this action is a topic for another day, but the fact is, a staggering percentage of players were willing to force a disconnect rather than play the game at a disadvantaged position of going second. So what rule change can we implement to bring a semblance of balance to players going second? I suggest giving them a mulligan. In a card game, a mulligan is essentially a chance to redraw your starting hand. Different card games have different rules on how this is performed, but I think for Yu-Gi-Oh! The most balanced form would be that if you're not pleased with the first 5 cards you draw to start the game, you can shuffle all 5 cards back into your deck and draw 5 more. This would certainly give the second player a greater probability of drawing what they need when being forced into a defensive or oppressive position. On top of that, it puts additional pressure on the first player. They may not want to overextend their plays, knowing their opponent's chance of dropping Ash, Nibiru, or Super Poly just increased. With extra hand control and an additional card to boot, going second suddenly doesn't seem so bad. The second rule change idea is incorporating deck size and turn order as their own mechanics. Most competitive duelists use the minimum deck size of 40 and the maximum extra deck size of 15. The decks are structured to prioritize consistency, since having more cards is generally seen as a less favorable thing. In this rendition, the player who has more cards in their deck will go first. I even have a cool animation for it. You have the Millennium Scales weigh the decks at the start of the duel, and whichever is heaviest goes first. And you don't know who's going first until the duel actually starts. For this weighing, cards in the extra deck don't count unless the decks have the same number of cards, in which case the extra decks are weighed, and whoever has the lightest extra deck will win. I can easily see this changing the strategy of how the game is played, as lots of duelists would likely gamble using 41 or 42 cards to inch off the 40 card line. We'd probably see more 50 card decks with people willing to sacrifice some consistency for the prospect of almost always going first. I definitely see it as a rule that would add some flavor to deck building strategy and shake up the 40 deck standard, while also giving duelists more control over their starting position than a 50-50 coin toss. Okay, this one is kind of out there, but I think it would be interesting to have a pre-duel veto, or prohibition in Yu-Gi-Oh terms. For this rule, both players will declare one card name before the duel starts, and if a player has that card, they have to remove all copies of that card from their deck, and then begin the duel. It's a good way for the current players to get rid of a specific card that they feel is unbalanced, or that they're just tired of running into in general. And it can relieve some pressure from both Komani and anyone who happens to be playing the designer deck of the month. As, since they'd have these soft bans, there would be less urgency to turn a blind eye for a few ban lists, then ban the deck into oblivion to make up for it. Now, some of you might feel it's too crippling to expect a deck to play without its ace card, but I say, if they're nothing without the card, then they don't deserve to have it. I can also see someone trolling the system, showing up to a duel with Snake Eyes sleeves and a Snake Eyes mate, then when the opponent calls Snake Eyes Original Sin, they remove the 3 copies from their deck and proceed to run a 37 card Exodia deck. Speaking of Snake Eyes, the amount of delinquent cards being mass produced has gotten out of hand. Having 1 or 2 is fine, but when you can make a third of your deck into 1 card combo starters, that's excessive. This rule change is simple. Have semi-limit be the standard. I'm sure some people think that that's going too far, and some people think it's not going far enough, but honestly, I feel that it's right in the middle. For people running 3 copies of a card, it might seem like a pain having to adjust, but at the end of the day, they can still play the cards just fine with 2 copies. And on the other side of the aisle, imagine you only have to deal with 9 of these delinquent cards, as opposed to 12. It will make a noticeable difference. Next rule change is to restore some of the uniqueness I think that field spells have lost over the years. As mentioned earlier, in the past, there used to be only 1 field spell allowed in play at a time, signifying that this was an effect that influenced the rules for both parties, whether it was an attack boost to all of a certain type of monster, or changing the conditions on summoning monsters in general. In addition to this far-reaching influence, a lot of these cards were more intricate than the average card, at the time, some of which powerful enough to disrupt the rules of the game while active. But at this point in time, field spells are more or less the same as continuous spell cards. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that there are quite a few continuous spell cards that feel more like field spells than actual field spells do. My suggested change is that the field spell should only affect the entire field if the other opponent doesn't have a field spell. I saw this animation in a Yu-Gi-Oh emulator, maybe Yu-Gi-Oh Pro, correct me if I'm wrong, comment section, where when a field spell was played, it would change the mat and wallpaper of the arena. Then if the other player used a field spell of their own, it would push the decorum back as far as the edge of their field, though it was purely aesthetic, unlike our suggested change. Though this change would be a bit of a nerf to field spells, I see it opening up a large window of strategies as players fight for home field advantage. It's like we're heading back to Duelist Kingdom, with high mountains on one side and deep oceans on the other. Even though it would technically be less powerful, I can see even decks without staple field spells tooling around with some field spell ideas to fend off another player's field dominance. This one is definitely overdue. I think everyone playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Can agree that special summoning is the least special type of summoning in the game. A player gets a strict one normal summon per turn, and then they can special summon an infinity number of times. On top of that, normal summoning isn't even exclusive. Tribute summoning also falls into that category of normal summoning. Tribute summoning is almost a lost art, and it's certainly dated in today's mechanics. Just think about it. When was the last time you actually tribute summoned a monster? And I don't mean tribute summon to special summon a monster, I mean actually tribute summoned in order to normal summon a monster. If you remember that, what was it that you actually tributed? Was it a token? Or was it an opponent's monster? Or else some false charity monster for your opponent? I'm the most retro duelist I know, and even I barely use this mechanic. It's just hard to justify sacrificing one, and in some cases two, perfectly good monsters for the possibility of getting something slightly stronger. And on top of that, this slightly stronger option must already be in your hand, when compared to trading for an extra deck monster that's always standing at the ready, and tend to be more powerful than even high-star main deck monsters. It's really no wonder that this method is rarely utilized. The rule change here is simple. Make tribute summoning its own mechanic, i.e., every turn each player will get one normal summon and one tribute summon. I honestly don't see this making a big impact on the game outside of a few niche strategies or some desperation moves. Even though it probably wouldn't be utilized much, it still gives tribute summoning a much needed upgrade. The Yu-Gi-Oh! Graveyard is kind of a joke. They should probably change the name to Card Purgatory, because half the monsters in there are just waiting for their chance to go somewhere else. These days, most duelists would be glad to start off with half their cards in their graveyard. It's like an easier to access deck. So let's make the Gravekeepers proud on this one, by restricting movement from the graveyard for the first 3 turns of a duel. Just think about it. In most cases, being bounced back to the deck is scarier than being sent to the graveyard. This rule change should give in-game death just a little more consequence, knowing that you can't just combo into most things right after being sent to the graveyard, but it shouldn't inhibit anybody's strategy mid to late game. Life points haven't changed since the game started, but our monsters and effects have gotten beefier and beefier. Today, it's not unheard of for someone to do 10,000 damage in one attack. This doesn't even consider the fact that we can now attack with 6 monsters in one battle phase without even utilizing effects. With the way the game is now, I don't think simply adding more life points would make a big difference. I think a healthier modification would be to add a critical limit. I see this working in a few different renditions, so starting from strictest to most interesting, in this first rendition, the built-in critical limit is 2,000. Once a player's life points hits that point for the first time every duel, they can no longer take damage, though their monsters can still be destroyed. This immunity to damage lasts until the start of the next turn. Note, it doesn't matter whose turn it was. If your opponent damaged you to the critical point during your turn, they can still finish the job during their turn. This rule change would eliminate OTKs, which I believe most players agree is toxic. It also gives players being pressed a little more wiggle room and an opportunity to recover. The next rendition is a lot less powerful, but still a pretty good aid when a duelist has their back against the wall. It basically works the same, except that the damage cancellation is a one-time occurrence. For example, if your opponent attacks directly with a monster that has 10,000 attack, your life points are reduced to 2,000. However, if they also have a monster with 3,000 attack that has yet to declare an attack this turn, they can still attack with that monster for game. The last rendition is the most complex, but I also think it's the most fun. And that is, players get to choose their critical limit. How this would work is before turn order is decided, both players will choose their critical limit. This is anywhere between 4,000 to 1,000, in intervals of 1,000. This would be a one-time save, like with the last example, so an opponent with multiple high attack monsters can still finish off their opponent via multiple attacks. However, there's a bonus effect. When an opponent hits their critical limit, starting at 3,000, they get a lifeline draw, where they immediately draw one card. Opponents cannot react to this action. A critical limit of 2,000 draws 2 cards, and a critical limit of 1,000 draws 3 cards. Essentially, you're gambling with the benefits that you could gain from this effect. I doubt this change would overly upset the current game, but having this extra lifeline in the hope of a true heart of the cards moment might free up some space for some epic comebacks and perhaps reduce the amount of players who scoop too early. And now we move to address a very common complaint: negates. I don't know about you, but I find it extremely annoying having to ask my opponent permission to play the game. Though negates as a whole are healthy, and oversaturation of negates is nothing short of disgust, kind of an unfair mechanic when unchecked, because the current structure allows a person to quickly gain a monopoly on negates, limited counterplay, and once the monopoly is established, the game is all but over. I'll be the first to admit my math grades weren't so good, but if your opponent has 7 negates on the field and you have 6 cards in your hand, there's a really good chance you're not going to be playing those cards. It shuts out an opponent before they even get a chance to play, and that's not very fun. No game should support game mechanics that prevent people from enjoying the game. Not without reason anyway. So my proposal is to limit the amount of negates a player can perform every turn. I would say somewhere between 3 and 5. Though someone with 3 negates on the field is in a pretty good position, I can still see some people complaining that it isn't enough. Though setting the limit to 5 might not change much. Someone breaking through 5 negates and still managing to do something substantial, but it'll still give a disadvantaged player a glimmer of hope that they can make a comeback. And 4 negates just kinda seems like an awkward number for a hard limit. So let me know in the comment section. If you had to choose a universal negate limit, what would it be? 3, 4, or 5? So there you have it. Reaper's 9 suggested rules to improve the quality of Yu-Gi-Oh! Today. We were thinking about doing 10, but now seeing the runtime, we'll probably just leave it at 9.
Are we not going to address the elephant in the room?
Oh, I was gonna wait till after the video, but since you brought it up, what's the deal with that elephant?
No, I meant.
Yeah, I know. Well, now you know how it feels. So, about the elephant in the room. The thing about modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Probably everyone was expecting me to bring up, that probably deserves its own video. So if you enjoyed this one, be on the lookout for a follow-up. And let us know in the comment section what you think about the suggested rule changes. Do you think any of these changes could be implemented in the future? Which rules did you like the most? And how would it change your playstyle? I'm definitely interested in hearing from other duelists. And if it's really good, we might mention it in the part 2. But for now, I think it's time to bring this video to a close. My name is D Reaper, and I'm a YouTuber for fun. Today's challenge?
Send someone to the shadow realm.
Good luck, and I'll see you all in the next one.